So this is a panel that it's really my privilege to be able to moderate, because I'm a trial lawyer, and one of the things that we do is we talk to the actual people who have the actual facts. And we've been talking a lot in this conference about people who engage in different groups. And we are really privileged to have here today some people who actually have lived that life and can give us the actual facts from their perspective. So we are really, really blessed to have them here. And we're going to start today with really one of the foremost experts in the world on this issue, Kathleen Blay, who early in the planning of this, I was privileged to meet. And over the course of it, so many people said, Kathleen Blay, I can't wait to meet her. I can't wait to come to Pittsburgh and meet her. And some of you are in the audience, and we had that conversation. So it really is my privilege to introduce to all of you Kathy Blay, who's going to lead us off.
Thank you. So I was asked to give a very short sense of what we know about the process of leaving extremism, extremist hate. So this is a complicated issue that involves a lot of research by a number of people who are at this summit. So let me try to summarize in a very short period of time what we know. And let me preface it by saying, to understand how and why people leave extremist hate and how and when they're successful doing so, you actually have to look at the whole picture of how and why people enter, what happens to people in extremist hate groups, whether they're in real life groups or virtual groups, and then how they leave, because this is an integrative process. And I'll give you some highlights and just to give you a sense of how factors at one point affect what happens at other points. So let me start with entry. This actually is the area that we as scholars know the most about. There's been quite a bit of research on how people come into extremist hate. And there's two processes of entering. There's a process of entering the ideology, adopting the beliefs. We usually think about that as radicalization. And then there's a process of entering a group or a community or a network. And we might think about that as affiliation. And in a nutshell, we know a couple of things. Well, we know a lot of things, but I'll highlight a couple of things that we know about entering. One of the things we know is that people rarely have extremist beliefs and then go out and look for a group to affiliate with. That's often the common perception. People are really racist or anti-Semitic, and they look for a group that matches their beliefs. But that really is not often the case. It's much more common that people come into a network, a group, with often some unformed racist ideas, but it's when they're in that network or that group that those ideas get elaborated. For example, instead of just sort of having common everyday kind of racist ideas, that's where they learn about great replacement theory that people have talked about a lot at this conference. It's also the process by which people become anti-Semitic. People rarely come into racist groups, certainly at least before about 5 years ago, but rarely came in with hardened anti-Semitic views. Anti-Semitism typically is something that people learn within extremist movements or groups or networks. It's one of what is offered to people who affiliate as a hidden truth, a secret that they get to learn, a bonus kind of being part of that world. Then let's move to once they're in extremist hate. What do we know about being in it? And let me mention three things. One thing we know is that being an extremist hate is what sociologists would call a totalizing culture. It can swamp everything. It becomes everything about your world. So it's not only what you believe and what actions you take, it directs what you're going to wear and who you're going to hang out with and what music you're going to listen to and where you're going to send your kids to school and what doctor you're going to go to. It's a whole world, encompassing world. The second thing we know is that despite this being an all-encompassing world, what people believe or say they believe when they're in extremist hate and what they do when they're in extremist hate are not perfectly matched. And one of those ways that they're not perfectly matched is that despite this being a totalizing culture that's all absorbing, many, many people, and particularly women, but men as well, maintain relationships with people on the outside who are not part of that world. Even though they often would deny that, they often hide that, but people often have a contact, often somebody from a childhood friend, a sibling or so forth, that they keep a secret contact with. And the third thing we know is that it's not only hate that brings people into that world and keeps them in that world. It's also fear, and we're actually just beginning to get a deeper understanding of the dynamics of fear and how those operate, both to keep people in racist groups and also to move people toward violence. Okay, now, how does that frame what happens when people leave? So despite this totalizing culture, this all-absorbing world, despite this ideology that people buy into, in fact, many people leave. Most people leave extremist hate. There's an incredible churn rate to extremist hate groups, networks, movements. People burn out, people leave for personal reasons, the groups dissolve, people get kicked out. So there's always a lot of leavers. And people can leave because they no longer believe, or they can leave and then stop believing later, or they can leave the belief and stay in the group. So there's all kinds of different ways that people leave. Leaving the group, leaving the ideology, both, leaving one or the other, or leaving neither. Colleagues of mine and I have done a study of quite a large number of former violent white supremacists, and we spent a long time doing personal interviews with people, 6 or 8 hour, very long interviews, to really understand how people left and what leaving meant, what the process of leaving was for them. And one of the things that we found was that, first of all, people who left often left because they mobilized the contact they had with somebody outside the group. Remember I said people often had a contact with somebody not in extremist hate? That is a contact that people often use to help them decide to leave or to be a safe way to leave extremist hate. Secondly, we found that people who were successful in leaving extremist hate were those people who were able to move out of that totalizing world, and I think Chris will talk about this, who were able to reduce their sense of fear as well as their sense of hate, were able to develop another world that compensates for the one they've left. Because when you leave extremist hate, you can leave all your support group, your friends, you might leave your employment, might have to leave the place you live. You really have to rebuild your life. So it's rebuilding your life that makes people more successful in leaving. But the third thing we found is that even people who successfully left their group, so they disaffiliated, and successfully left the ideology, so they de-radicalized. And even when that had happened quite a long time ago, many years ago, people reported they still had trouble shaking their former extremist, racist thoughts, feelings, and bodily reactions. So people who had been out of hate for many years and wanted to be out of hate would talk about hearing a piece of music, seeing a word, having an image flash through their mind, and saying it would bring it all back. It made them crave that experience again. It made them have a visceral bodily craving of something that they had rejected. So the people who talk about this as feeling addicted to white supremacy. Now I'm not saying it is an addiction, right? But I'm saying that's the way that people think about that you can, give up alcohol, you can give up smoking, but you're always vulnerable to that pullback. And that's how people talk about white supremacy. Even when they've given it up, occasionally they feel a pullback. So one of the things I'll be interested to hear from Chris is the extent to which those kind of processes are mirrored in his life, because I think they point to not only the dedication it takes for someone to leave, but the difficulty and sometimes the unanticipated forms of difficulty that happen in the leaving process.
Great, thank you, Kathy. And Chris Buckley, I'm watching you nod your head as you're listening to her. So know you're with Parents for Peace now, and would really love to hear your story and your journey.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Blee. It's an honor to sit on the same stage as you. So I had a slideshow put together, and I'm going to just go ahead and build right off of what you pitched over to me. So I am a recovering drug addict, as well as a former white supremacist. Growing up, I was abused sexually, physically, by an uncle, and physically by my father. My dad was alcoholic, drug addict. Fast forward, I had my experiences with bullying, racism at an early age, picked up racist thoughts and ideas from my parents, but as a young child, those thoughts were conflicted because of the friends that I had. So I had a very diverse group of friends, which kind of, it conflicted with the ideology from home. So we moved south. I ended up joining the Army. I did 13 years in the United States Army, combat tours to Afghanistan, and I lost the very most important friend that I had ever had in my life to date to enemy fire from insurgent forces. I was very close to him, when it happened, and I took a veer in the road, and one part of my life would have took me towards VA, mental health, rehabilitation, trauma counseling, and the other end took me down the road that so many other veterans and former military members take towards substance abuse, extremist ideologies, radical thoughts and processes. So there was a big cycle that happened on the way back. I had a Humvee accident. I broke my back. Ended up being med boarded out of the Army because it was such a major injury. And I was told that the process could take up to 2 years. I had 7 years till retirement. So that was the real first experience with opiate painkillers. And that spiraled out of control to heroin, methamphetamines, cocaine, whatever you could think of, I'd take it. And I didn't realize what process was happening, right? So as my life progressed, I started to not be able to contain the traumas, the experiences that I had been through in my life, and they all came to the top, right? The ability to hold them back and process them or hide from them was now being subverted with substance abuse. And so they come out in one way or another. coupled by the fact, like, this is a mind blower here, right? So while I was in Afghanistan, the tour right before my last one, I voted for President Obama. I wanted to be part of that history that elected the first black president of the United States. Subsequently, when I got out on my last tour, Obama was in his second term. And ironically, I radicalized under the same president that I voted in. So the slide show's real quick. I'm just going to kind of talk through it. So next slide. A little bit about Parents for Peace. We're founded by Melvin Bledsoe and Monica Hawley, his daughter, in 2015. Melvin's son committed an act of terror. He killed a U.S. service member and was radicalized. Myrieme touched on this in an earlier panel. And we've actually created the first ever non-governmental helpline, and you'll touch on that one. And then we do the work, and we're working on a methodology on how to do the work. Next slide. So this is me post-recovery from hate and addiction to substances, which is why I was nodding when Kathy was saying that, because it's such a parallel. So, you can see that all of these things were a trauma to me. And there could have been so many more pictures, but I just wanted to keep it simple. So next slide. This is some of the things that I've experienced after, and you'll see that there are a lot of very important people on that page. A lot of motivation to change. And the first change I had to make was sobriety, because without a sober mind, I couldn't have a sober heart. So next slide. All right, so these are the things that you were interested in, the common similarities between extremism and addiction. If you look, these are all signs that if you didn't know the signs, you couldn't tell, is that extremism or is that addiction, right? I come up with this because during the course of my recovery, I had a conversation with Myrieme Churchill. I've talked to Mubin Sheikh, Pardeep Kalik. I just had lots of conversations about, can I be addicted to an emotion or a feeling the same way I'm addicted to a substance? There's not a no answer, there's not a yes answer. It's a very new thought process that we're coming up with. So at that point, I have an obligation. I have to finish this out. I have to see where it leads me. And because of that parallels that I found, I said, if I can be addicted to a feeling, the same way, for example, a sex addict or a gambling addict is addicted to a feeling, not necessarily a substance, then maybe I can treat it the same way I treated my substance addiction. So I read a book by Russell Brand, and it was about addiction and what the 12 steps were designed to mean, how they work. And he basically said the 12 steps mean what you need them to mean. So once I realized that I could dissect that program and completely recreate it the way I needed to recreate it, we come up with a program called TRP. So next slide. TRP is a moral cognitive approach to allow the participant to identify those traumas that they experience in their life, isolate those traumas, and treat those traumas in a healthy manner, allowing them to effectively reintegrate into society in an appropriate way, in a healthy way. It's a very long, grueling process, non-medication. We actually incorporate a clinician for the client to have that mental health support, because I'm not a clinician. I'm just a guy who went through some stuff, who figured out some other stuff that might be true, okay? So next slide. The TRP that we have completed to date, we have 2 programs fully completed and one almost complete that's in the process. So we have one for law enforcement, first responders, because I think it's very important that law enforcement has a healthy way to process their trauma that they experience when they're protecting and serving, and a lot of those things are carried home and carried to work with them, and vice versa. My true love, the U.S. military, we took an oath that we'll never leave a fallen comrade, And I've seen such a rise in former military, veterans, and current military members in extremist groups that I was interacting with when I was involved with the KKK. 090 Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys, they're radicalizing. So what can I do to save those comrades? So military TRP was the first one done. And we're actually working on one for prison and incarcerated type of extremist gangs. And we actually, with the military support, we actually created a sub-program for spouse and family members of loved ones to help support that member that's going through this transition. Next slide. So one of the things that I've found it really hard to have a conversation around is the stigma of mental health. Some of the things that we have found in my experience working at Parents for Peace, doing interventions, shadowing the clinicians and learning and trying to build a skill set of my own to be effective, was that I come up with three main pillars that I found that are pretty much common all across the board. One being trauma, the other one being a form of substance abuse, and the third one being mental health. And sometimes they're that overlap, and you'll have like 2 or 3 of the same things. So these are some of the symptoms that I've noticed from what we've interacted with, the spectrum and Asperger's type of autism, the ADHD, ADD, depressions, anxieties, PTSD. And the funny thing about it is, like, all of those pillars that I just mentioned is me. I had PTSD from combat. I had a substance abuse disorder, and I had, the trauma. We could talk for hours about the trauma. But so that's the TED Talk. I just wanted to, just kind of talk about what I was doing. We'll be around, and if anybody's more interested on those programs, I can definitely fill you in. I've got materials, and I'm just happy to be here. So one of the questions that I heard was, is de-radicalization possible? Yes. I'm here to show you that it's possible. You'll find people who do it for whatever reason. I do it because I have to. I inherited this. This is what my life consists of now, is taking back all the bad and helping other people that I didn't have to help me. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. We also wanted to share with you the story of a young woman who also entered an extremist group and then departed it. So they could not be with us. It's Lauren Manning and her mother. And so we wanted to bring you the child and the parent who went through that journey together. If you could play that for us, please.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm Lauren. I'm 31 years old and I'm a former far-right extremist. My life wasn't always full of violence and crime. I grew up in what looked like your typical middle-class family. My dad was a police officer and my mom worked in land surveying. They say not to judge a book by its cover. People look at me as though I have two heads when I tell them that my dad was once on the force and I was once in a gang, but the reality is that this can happen to any family. Alcoholism runs on both sides of the family, so seeing dysfunction was never a foreign concept to me. Some relatives hid their addictions well, while others made it blatantly obvious. My grandfather was toxic and would regularly make nasty remarks about my weight, appearance, academic achievement in school, and anything else he could find. I would also hear racist and homophobic rants from him. Many of these comments were similar to what I'd hear later on. So did I agree with everything he said? No. Did I become desensitized to it? Yes. I was 16 when my dad passed after a 9-year battle with cancer. He was my best friend, and thereafter I was left with this huge void. My family seems to think that a switch flipped in me after seeing my dad lifeless. This is probably true. However, there were seeds planted well before this. So at first I took to binge drinking within a few months, but eventually this wasn't enough. I was dead silent in school, but as soon as I left the building, I never failed to find trouble of some kind. I liked the instant gratification this gave me, even if it did come with consequences. I was opposed to the mainstream as I felt I had no place there. I was into the metal scene, and it was the energy and aggression of this music that resonated with me. At age 17, I met the individual who recruited me into the white power movement. He befriended me, told me it was good to be different, while referring to everyone else as sheep. I met him online via this chat forum dedicated to death metal music. He was messaging people in that space because at the time, metalheads were considered outcasts, and because of this, he saw it as the perfect breeding grounds. The online conversations would soon turn into in-person meetings. Having a place with this group did come with strings attached in the sense that there's just things they expected you to know. If I wasn't with the hate group, I could be found on the internet looking at sites like Stormfront. I educated myself so that I could throw the rhetoric at other people. I loved arguing online and knew this impressed my new friends. And I also enjoyed the sense of validation I got from it. While I was absorbing this online content, I began to view the world from a very narrow perspective. I would cherry pick at certain details and then create narratives in my own head. My family couldn't handle my drinking, aggression, or newfound belief system any longer. Shortly after I turned 18, my mom kicked me out and I found myself homeless. I left the first group after repeated conflicts with them. Since I expressed how tired I was of this group's inner drama and made an announcement that I wanted to leave, they grew suspicious of me. As a result, they jumped me and beat me senseless, and at this point, I knew I needed protection from my old group, and unfortunately, I wasn't ready to change quite yet. A couple months down the road, I found the larger movement within Canada. Once again, I met someone online who introduced me to the rest of his friends. This one seemed more organized than the last. They had beef with my old friends while holding the same belief system. This group was trying for a more clean-cut image. I was told not to wear my combat boots anymore, grow my hair out, and try to present myself in a more civilized fashion. The start of my disengagement came in 2012 after another member was murdered. He was a close friend of mine. Others had spread rumors claiming that someone attacked him due to his affiliation, when the reality is he walked into this death trap himself. Because of this, I started questioning this victim complex of ours, like who was actually making our lives miserable. On September 1st, 2012, I quit drinking because I had liver cirrhosis. I showed up at this gathering and other members were thrown off as they'd never seen me sober before. They were not supportive of my sobriety, so I slowly but surely cut ties with these people. I split up with my boyfriend, telling him I did not want to live out this idea of having a kid and raising them to hate. Also, I did not want to play this role of subservience that's expected of women any longer. I was tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. In 2013, I got a job working in construction, and at the time I was working around people of many different ethnicities and walks of life. What I realized after spending 8 hours a day around them was that I could not hate them because I got to know them. I had this introspection period where I took the time to question if I ever had any bad experience with anyone who doesn't look like me, and the answer is no. Still, I was struggling with the residual hardwiring in the sense that racial slurs would come to mind, and this made me question if I had really changed or not. So, putting the internet to good use, I learned critical thinking skills and the practice of mindfulness. Since I had racist tattoos from my past, I'd done both tattoo cover-up and laser removal. The cover-ups were fun to do. The laser removal was incredibly expensive and painful. Having these tattoos removed and covered changed my interactions with other people. Intellectually, I knew my thinking was different at this point. However, having people confront me in public about my unwanted tattoos was very discouraging when it would happen. Many formers do experience harassment to some degree from former affiliates, and I'm no exception this way. Eventually, I had to navigate building resilience towards this. There was nothing I could do about their actions, but I could change the way I responded to it. Eventually, my solution, of course, was not responding to it. I work with Life After Hate currently, which helps people disengage from the violent far right. Often my strategy is one which comes from a place of non-judgment. I found that helping them process through their experiences is far more helpful than offering opposing points of view. Many of the people I've served have experienced a deep sense of guilt, so realistically, there's no need for me to lecture them either. Instead, I listen, and I encourage open dialogue. What I was looking for when I was younger was a sense of identity, belonging, and someone who would have my back. These promises fell short when I was actually in the group. What I found when I was there was a lot of misogyny, intergroup violence, and senseless drama. Upon disengagement, I knew I had to find these things elsewhere or within myself. When it came to identity, this has been an ongoing process. Identity encompasses many things, so I ask myself questions such as, without the group's influence here, what do I like? What don't I like? Who am I? In terms of a sense of belonging, I'd say my standards are pretty open now compared to what they used to be. I'm willing to befriend anyone with a wild sense of humor, and I think this leaves me with a lot of options. In terms of someone having my back, I don't feel I need that anymore to the same degree as I used to. I do have positive supports now. However, I won't rely on them to the same degree as I relied on the hate group that I was once a part of.
At least this time, I'm leaving on good terms. That's what my daughter Lauren said to me as she prepared to move out 2 months ago. We laughed, of course, but between us lay the painful memory of my ultimatum to her 13 years ago, when she left our family for a group of disreputable skinheads loosely affiliated with white supremacy. There's a very real sense of loneliness and desperation that accompanies having your child choose extremists over their family, the people who've encouraged and loved them their entire lives. You question yourself, your parenting skills, your own morals and values, and you ask yourself, who am I to have raised an extremist? What kind of a person does that make me when my child prefers hate over my love? Where did I go wrong? I was fortunate that my mother, my son, and my best friend provided me with much needed support when Lauren was involved in extremism. But despite their love, I still felt that sense of loneliness, overwhelming shame and guilt. Even more so when coworkers and friends would talk in glowing terms of their own kids' accomplishments. The risk of being judged by them, by our extended family, and the many neighbors I'd known since our kids went to grade school together, was always uppermost in my mind when Lauren's name would come up in conversation. "Oh, she's decided to try living in the city with some friends," I'd remark airily. I couldn't tell them the truth, that for the better part of a year, Lauren had been self-radicalizing while barely finishing her final year of high school. I'd known nothing of her involvement until it was too late. Even then, I'd been too naive to string together the words white and supremacist, unable or unwilling to see how firmly she'd become entrenched in hate. Her anger, always quick to flare, had become physically and emotionally disruptive, the targets usually her brother and myself, and attributed her pain and anger to grief, since we'd lost her father 2 years earlier. But nothing I've ever experienced could have prepared me for the realization that my beautiful, talented daughter was now an extremist. Fast forward to 2017, 2 years after Lauren had disengaged from her extremist lifestyle. She was working as an exit specialist with Life After Hate, helping other formers regain their own lives. I'd always forbidden her to speak about her white supremacist practices, but now that she'd shed her old life, we began to open up. "I guess you didn't feel you could confide in any of your friends," she said to me one day. "Too bad parents only brag about the good stuff. They never talk about the bad things that kids do." She had a point. There's a parenting stigma we've all fallen victim to, the one that insists you're not to talk about anything negative. In other words, we're holding back sharing the bad things our kids do for fear of being shamed, embarrassed, or thought less of by other parents, remaining silent rather than sharing. That's counterproductive. It reinforces the notion that our kids are bad or that we've done something wrong. It's in the bad times that we, and parents facing similar obstacles, need support the most, whether it's a shoulder to cry on, words of advice, or just knowing that someone else has had the same experience. Children don't come with manuals. None of us receives training in anything other than changing diapers and bathing babies. So why do we only share those hallmark moments? Having missed the roots of Lauren's self-consciousness and lack of confidence, I, of course, also missed the signs of her radicalization. I mistook anger for grief, defiance for loss, discomfort for teenage angst. not realizing there were so many other factors at play. Looking back, I can see, among other things, how our parenting created shy, reticent children, and how my father's bigotry and prejudice laid the foundations for Lauren's racist beliefs. Hindsight is indeed a great thing, and while it comes too late to help Lauren and I, both of us are using it in our interactions with families of radicalized youth. Since the publication of our memoir, I've been creating resource guides for parents, caregivers, and teachers to help them understand extremism. In researching these, I've come up with a few parenting skills that I try to pass along whenever possible. Perhaps, for instance, if parents like myself knew how to question their kids to find out how they really felt, we'd have fewer youth searching for that sense of belonging, identity, or purpose. If we knew how to actively listen, using our eyes, ears, and hearts, and not our mouths, we'd have kids who felt listened to, understood, and important within their own families. If we knew the early signs of indoctrination, we'd have fewer youths being pulled into that rabbit hole of extremism. And perhaps, if we spoke respectfully of others, no matter their race, religion, or ethnicity, our children would grow up to do that very same thing. But let's assume that these best case scenarios don't happen, that this young person like Lauren is in fact successfully recruited online and now holds some, if not all, of his new friends' beliefs. How can we and his parents win the tug of war between family and extremism when these new ideals seem so much more attractive and exciting than school, friends, mom and dad? Education, I believe, is the key, and yet it's the most difficult part of this equation. How do we get parents and teachers to understand the severity of extremist recruitment when law enforcement and government agencies won't take it seriously? Extremism creates hundreds of thousands of victims every day, recruits their families, entire racial and religious segments of the population. What will it take for those in power to set up a notice? When Lauren first left home, somebody said to me, "Keep the door open." Those 4 words kept giving me hope. They kept me going through those painful, lonely nights when I wondered if I would ever see my daughter again. Through Life After Hate's Family Forum, I now have the opportunity to educate parents, to guide them through their painful journeys, and to instill in them the sense of hope that I clung to when I needed it most. If we can encourage families to keep the door open, to continue communicating with their radicalized children, and if we can give those parents the tools they need to succeed, perhaps we'll have more happy endings like ours.
On behalf of Lauren and myself, thank you so much for allowing us to participate today. If you'd like to read our memoir, Walking Away from Hate, it's available at all major booksellers throughout North America, the UK, and limited European countries. Our 2 resource guides can be downloaded for free from tidewaterpress.ca. And if you have questions or comments you'd like to reach either one of us, please feel free to email us or contact us through our Facebook page.
Thank you. You heard them mention Life After Hate. They were not able to join us today. There are people from Life After Hate here, so if you're interested in the organization, take a look at them afterwards. We heard the mother's heart there. Myrieme, Parents for Peace, do you want to talk to us about the work that you do and the role that parents play?
Yes, so I'm so glad that we just watched that video because it represents exactly who we are talking to every single day in our helpline at Parents for Peace. And I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge our first responders team. Chris and I came to this conference with our first responders team, and while we were doing all this speaking in this wonderful event, they had to pull away one after the other. Emma Jouen, who are our helpline coordinator, had to pull to do just an intake not too long ago. Pardeep Kaleka, who is also a trauma counselor and who also speaks to people every day, had to go to a hotel. And then Mubin Sheikh, he's also a former Islamist who was also part of our team. So it's important for me to acknowledge our team because this is what we do behind the scene every single day. Speak to moms and daughters like exactly this in this situation. So Chris went over Parents for Peace quite a bit, and the one who heard me speak this morning, heard me say that Parents for Peace is a nonprofit that was really made of parents, just like this mom, who were impacted by extremism. Many of their loved ones died fighting overseas in Syria and Somalia. In matter of fact, the first young American woman was groomed and recruited and went to Syria, and she was the first American woman who died fighting overseas. Some of our members, children, had been a propaganda to recruit Western kids. So the organization started with a real tragedy. And when I joined Parents for Peace, I really didn't understand what that was about. I'm a therapist. I worked in a very difficult setting, like, in human trafficking and sex trafficking. But when Mr. Bloodsoe asked me to help him, he said, look, if this is happening to my son, it must be happening to other people. And so the first job that I did, and which was the most challenging, is actually to look at other families, just like the one we see today, and the one from Mr. Bloodsoe. So I traveled all over the United States to look for those families of extremism. I also traveled in different parts of Europe to meet those families, and also in Canada and in North Africa. What was astonishing for me was people were different, speaking different language, from different religion, but they were telling me the same story. The same story, the story that we heard now, the story that Chris told me, and that was just on, and I just couldn't believe it. Like most of people after the Charlie Hebdo attack when I was in Paris, I was extremely angry. I just want people to be held accountable, and that was it. But when I started speaking to families, and then I want to speak to formers, it became clear to me that actually those families were trying to do something. They had no idea what to do and where to ask for help. So the job that I did, I didn't realize I was about to do like a forensic investigation, but I was asking questions to those people across the world. Who was your son like before he was radicalized? What was his pain? What was he look like in his best way? What did you miss? What were the signs? What do you regret? What would you have done differently? So those questions made me hungrier and hungrier. I came back home with a wealth of information. And, and then we decided to work, and we put together a helpline protocol that was based on the insight of those families and the formers. So when we beta tested this helpline, that was a little scary, and we were not sure what we were doing. 6 years later, what was really incredible is that this helpline, became our teacher, speaking with one family at a time, and one person in the hate at a time, started to teach us about what is this issue, what is this problem. And actually, I realized that this is not a terrorist issue. This is a public health issue. This is, that was very clear. And matter of fact, today we realize that 60% of our callers are about kids that are on the spectrum, because of their brain way of thinking about black and white, cross ideology. And, so responding to the helpline have helped us really understanding that the family members, we all fantasize about who are those families. We just saw this mom. But really, last week we just launched our very first peer support because we want to break the silence and the taboo among families. And among the callers, some are ER urgentists, doctors. They send their kids to private school. We have some are nurses and business people and teachers. So the diversity of families that are struggling with extremism is astonishing. But what I realized that a successful grooming into extremism is isolation and shame. Because what groomers do very well is they isolate the vulnerable young person, or the person that, the two groups that I identify are youth, because of their developing brain and underlying issues, and veterans, the two parts that are vulnerable. And so when they are isolated by groomers, they do a really great job. And families really experience shame. It's extremely shameful when that happens to those families. If you see about who had been in this conference, you will say that those families look like just any of us. And we have to remember that. Fear sometimes makes us fantasize that this must be others. I begged Congress to listen to us and to inform them that, look, there are families that are afraid and they are not speaking up because they are scared. This issue is too politicized, they are scared to talk, and therefore we have kids that are being radicalized. So the helpline served to really do prevention, education, and intervention. As I said this morning, this is a human story, and radicalization is a psychological manipulation. So the way we change that is to make sure that people are not alone. What I find out, during my trip with families is that they have tried to find help. They spoke to teachers. They went to speak to clergies. They spoke to therapists. And today, we have a problem. We really have a problem. Because those families, they said, before they found us, we Googled social worker, white power, nobody could help them. Social workers and clinicians are not trained. And even worse, the case that we are working with today, I don't know if you guys have read the Bloomberg article of our work last week, and there are a few families. We have 2 reporters that were shadowing our work for over 2 months, which is actually great for us because we want to make sure that more people see what we are doing so they understand the issue, so we can do something about this, so we can have a public health response. So, trying to get the clinician attention had been extremely difficult. Solutions really are so close to us, and they are possible to be implemented. So the peer support that we have is one of the solutions so parents can start speaking up. More we speak up, more it becomes mainstream, and more we can start working on solutions. And I could go on and on, but I think my time is up.
Thank you. And Myrieme is going to be here later, so please, if anybody has any other questions, we're trying to make up a little bit of time here, so I apologize for cutting you off.
No, not at all.
Gordon Clubb is here with us from Europe. He has done quite a bit of work overseas. And Gordon, are these issues resonating with you? Are you seeing the same thing in the formers and the recruitment processes that you've been studying?
I think there are similarities in the work done in CBE, but perhaps I can flesh out one possible difference. My work looks at the role of former extremists and former combatants within CBE, and today we've heard powerful stories and examples of how formers can, the narratives of formers can inspire others to leave organisations. So we've seen not only that the formers the narratives and stories are important, but also the role as formers themselves can be important in CBE. Now, perhaps one of the differences in Europe, and certainly in the UK, is the greater scepticism of involving formers within CBE. And opinions can be quite strong and diverse. So on the one hand, you have the view that formers have unique insights and can provide added value. On the other hand, a strong view I hear within the CBE circles in Europe is that formers provide little added value, and their involvement can be counterproductive to the programmes and to their own existence. I mean, now, on this panel, we've already heard the positive role that formers played in CBE, and continue to play, and I've happily put myself in the pro-formers camp. But it's important to evaluate this wider debate because it is particularly relevant when today we talk about the lessons we can learn from the inside. So we need to understand the role of formers and the evidence base behind that. So I think the first important point to make is the need to avoid dangerous generalizations. Not all formers are necessarily good at CBE. Also, not all formers who are good at CBE are good at it because they are formers. But some formers can draw upon narratives and credibility to reach areas which are typically hard to reach. And a second point, I think, is about context. Formers in conflict settings, for example, they have different capacities and needs. In Northern Ireland, we see former combatants playing a crucial role in preventing violence, but they're not de-radicalized to the extent we'd expect in other contexts, by any stretch of the imagination. In typical CVE settings, in Europe and in America, the expectations of formers being de-radicalized is rightfully much higher. So we need to consider the role of context when we're considering what formers can do, the lessons we can learn from formers, and the ability for formers to be active themselves in CVE. And the key challenge that we face is evidence and the lack of it. As a lot of the evidence we have is anecdotal, but there are some useful insights, some emerging research, which can identify roles where formers are more productive within CVE. There's one study, for example, which shows how the narratives of formers told through a school performance can have a positive effect in primary intervention setting, reducing the likelihood of people having radicalized views. I mean, even today on stage, and Chris gave such a powerful talk, you know, these narratives work. We also see that the use of formers in online interventions being highlighted as successful. Formers are involved in peer mentoring, especially in the UK, where we have formers being involved in peer mentoring. The results, evidence base is a bit mixed with that, but nevertheless, it shows the different variety of roles formers can have. But nevertheless, the debate is still to be had. You know, there's some evidence which shows that formers can be counterproductive, that they can, that there should be more restraints on the use of formers in the CVE program. And so when we think of these challenges, we need to think of safeguards within program designs to ensure their own assistance is not affected, because it can be quite traumatic to relive your experience again and again. And it's important that they're not being exploited by programs, because there are some cases where formers are used in CVE programs, and it can be quite challenging and detrimental to themselves and to their own mental health. And I think it's important in programs where formers are being used. I mean, there are different variety of programs I recognise, but it's important that there are off-ramps for formers, that there's a way for programs which are working with formers in a CVE capacity to help them become former formers. So I think we need to consider how we work with formers and how CVE programs utilise formers to be the most effective. So going forward, we need to keep learning the lessons from inside, particularly from formers. I'm very passionate about this topic. I'm very passionate about defending the use and the values of formers. And while obviously more research is required, it's important to not generalise one way or the other. There are many examples of the involvement of formers in CVE being effective. The onus should be on identifying the ways to utilise those strengths. I know we're short of time, so I'll end that there, but I'm happy to take any questions if there are. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. And I don't know if any of you had a chance to attend the COVID panel today, but one of the things that was discussed there is how COVID has exacerbated these senses of isolation. We've seen in the reports how it has increased substance abuse, how it has increased depression and mental illness in children. And so COVID has in many ways exacerbated what many people here have talked about. And so as parents, it was important to us that you hear these stories today. And as you're thinking what you can do as parents, you can be alert to and sensitive to these issues in your own children. And in the interest of time, because we were trying to catch up a little, I'm going to take the liberty of sharing two ideas that our panelists had raised with us about go forward, and then I'm going to just open it up very quickly if anybody wants to add a plus one. One is, you heard already that we need to think of this as a mental health issue, and we need to resource it accordingly. We need to train social workers to be alert to these issues and to understand these issues, and to not stigmatize them in ways that paralyze our ability to help people who need help to come out of these movements. The second thing that didn't come up today, but it came up in our prep, and I want to mention it, is the development of standards. Gordon touched on it a little bit, but there are a lot of people who are working in this field, many of them in very good faith, but there are no standards, there's no accreditation, there's no mental health framework in existence for how you do this work. we think we know, that the peer component is important, as it is in any kind of a field, to have peers, to have formers helping other formers. But how we do that and the standards with which we need to do it don't exist. And so it appears to be a place that's ripe for development. Kathy, do you want to have the last word of other things that you would like to put out there for to-dos?
Just to build on the idea of the public health model, I just want to echo something that our wonderful scholar who's here, Cynthia Miller-Idris, wrote about years ago, which is the need to have a model of broad counter-extremism, similar to what had operated in Germany at that time, that's everywhere, that's in schools and churches and recreational spaces, to really meet people where they are. So not a mental health program that's only in clinicians, but that's more broadly diffused across the society.
Thank you, Kathy. And I just want to acknowledge very quickly, this whole summit is based on the concept of taking the worst moment of your life and transforming it into something that is positive and helps others in this world. So I just want to thank Lauren and Jeanette remotely, and I want to thank Chris for doing precisely that and for being with us today. So thank you very much.